Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Jordan Cash, who's an assistant professor of political science at Michigan State University. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Can I just ask you, first of all, what you make of Haley's exit from the race?
Well, it's not too surprising, especially after last night. There wasn't really a avenue for victory for Nikki Haley. So even though she said that she was going to continue on to the bitter end, clearly there was no path to victory for her, especially after last night.
OK, and it sounds like her supporters might not necessarily support Donald Trump. And given the marginal nature of the last Biden-Trump match, I mean, fair to say each candidate needs all the support they can get.
Absolutely. It's going to be very interesting to see where the Haley voters go. And it was also interesting to see Trump's reaction. You know, after he won Iowa, he was very conciliatory, inviting DeSantis supporters and Haley supporters to come to him. So the fact that he was not very magnanimous after last night's victory, isn't out of character for Trump, but it may not be the wisest political move. Joe Biden, on the other hand, I think was quite open and friendly, welcoming to Haley's supporters. So it'd be very interesting to see where her supporters go if they go home, so to speak, and vote for Trump as a Republican candidate, if they do cross the aisle for Joe Biden. Or what I think you're likely to see from many of these Haley voters is they either leave the top of the ticket blank or they just stay home. They're demoralized. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens because there doesn't seem to be a clear home for these Haley voters.
Yeah, so that's going to count against Donald Trump potentially. But something that's counting against President Biden is the fact that voters, even in his own party, are punishing him over the handling of the situation in Gaza. I mean, is that likely to compensate for the loss of votes that Trump might get because of the Haley supporters that won't support him?
I think it's a very similar phenomenon. Last night, you saw in several states the uncommitted vote was actually quite high. My state of Michigan, which had its primary last week, the uncommitted vote got 100,000 votes. That's an extremely high number for an incumbent president running basically unopposed. So I think both candidates, Trump needing to get these Haley voters, Biden needing to figure out his own party, get these voters who are registering their protest with him back in the fold as well. Otherwise, I think it's a very similar thing. Either they'll go home to Joe Biden, they'll possibly vote for a third party. There are more left-leaning third-party candidates that are getting on the ballot in the various states. Or again, the possible option is they stay home or they don't vote for president. So both Trump and Biden have a bit of a turnout issue, trying to get these voters who are not happy with this rematch.
Yeah, I mean, the majority of Americans don't want a 2020 rematch. So is there any way anybody else could enter this race between now and November somehow or another?
It's increasingly unlikely. The only, I guess, wild card you might see is the no labels movement, which has said they wanted to turn out a unity ticket if it's Trump versus Biden again. So far, all their potential candidates, Joe Manchin, for example, or Larry Hogan, Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, Larry Hogan, the former governor of Maryland, they've both decided not to run for president. Hogan's not running for the Senate. So that seems to be the only possible viable option, but that window is closing extremely quickly. They don't seem to have a plan so far. So barring any truly unforeseen circumstances, including the age of the candidates, which we have to remember, both candidates are older. And with Trump's indictments, there's a possibility that he is actually convicted. So those would be other potential things that would shake up the race. But other than these extreme cases, it looks like this is our 2024 field, Trump versus Biden.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's all mapped out, and yet there are these unknowns given, as you say, the age of the two men and the circumstances in which Donald Trump finds himself, legally speaking. I mean, were he to be convicted, and I'd like to ask you if you see that as being a likely scenario and jailed potentially, what would happen then? What would the Republican Party do? And would it matter if that happened after the formalization of his candidacy in June?
Yeah, these are all difficult questions in unprecedented circumstances. I would say that the likelihood of him being convicted of at least one, I think, is relatively high. Um, Particularly the New York case about um, fraud concerning some hush money payments. Given the location of that court case, I would imagine that's not going to look too good. The other cases, it's hard to say because there aren't dates set for a lot of these cases. So it's unclear if we're even going to have trials before the election. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that he is convicted of something before the Republican nomination. I think that would depend on if Republicans actually, are that concerned about such a conviction. Right now, it seems like every time he was indicted, his poll numbers went up. I think a lot of Republicans see these indictments as politically motivated, so they don't see it as rule of law. They see it as a targeting of Donald Trump. So it may not be as big of a deal to the Republican Party if he is convicted. Now, that still leaves the general election where it clearly is a big deal. Polling shows that a lot of voters who might support Trump wouldn't support Trump if he is convicted. So that's the bigger question I think Republicans are going to have to wrestle with.
All right. Okay, I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut you short because we're running out of time, but I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Jordan Cash, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Michigan State University. Thank you very much indeed.